Ladies and gentlemen, let me begin the PIDE webinar. We are today very fortunate to be joined by Dr. Hafiz Pasha. Everybody knows him. I don't need to introduce him, but I will still do a bit of an introduction, mainly to honor him because he deserves honor from all of us. Dr. Hafiz Pasha, first of all, I might claim, is a very good friend, has been a good friend for a long time. But more importantly, Dr. Hafiz Pasha is one of our best known economists. He served in the UN as a senior undersecretary, but more importantly, he has always remained an academic at heart, no matter what he did. He was also the finance minister of Pakistan. He was also the deputy chairman of the planning commission, but he always came back to academia, which is something I admire in him. He never became a politician, never became a VIP. He remained an academic at heart. You could not put the VIP in him, even if you tried. So Dr. Pasha always stuck to his writing, his academic books and his thoughts. Recently, he's written 3 important books, which is what we want to discuss today. He wrote a book called The Reform of Pakistan, a regular tome, a big book. I have it somewhere. I should have kept it on hand, but unfortunately, I was called away to a meeting and I couldn't keep it next to me, but I will bring it up as he speaks. And he then did a book called The Charter of the Economy. And then he also did something called the Human Development Report, the UNDP. All 3 of them set out, first of all, a very detailed examinations of the economy, as you would expect from him. I don't think you would expect anything less. But also, more importantly, he talks extensively of the future vision of Pakistan and of the reform that is necessary. We have been trying to do at PIDE these visions for the economy because we think the economy has been forgotten. Dr. Saab, despite your best efforts, unfortunately, this country remains economically illiterate. It's very sad at the end of our lives to be saying that, but it is sad. And unfortunately, the policymakers seem so dumbstruck that they don't even know what economic policy is. So Dr. Saab, what we need from you and all Pakistani economists that I'm trying that let's bring them back to what the economy is. Let's show them that there is a future in this country and let's show them how to unlock that future. So this is the conversation we want from you, and Dr. Saab, you are the best position to do it. And that is why I was very keen to get you, because you are going to, in a sense, underpin this conversation where I am trying, and with your blessing, I'm trying to bring in all young as well as old economists. I'm trying to have a broad-based dialogue to get everybody to see, hey, there is a future. If only we could get economics head together. So with that, Dr. Pasha, I would like to welcome you. Chahe Urdu mein bole, chahe Angrezi mein bole, I would welcome your remarks, opening remarks. Then we'll have a conversation. Pehle hum thodi si conversation khud karenge, phir hum questions lenge floor se, and hopefully we will make this so meaningful, bring out your thoughts that you have put in many books and many areas. So over to you, Dr. Pasha.
Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. My deep gratitude to you, Nadeem. You have been one of my dearest friends, literally for the last almost 4 or more decades. And we have all stood by each other in difficult times. And I'm truly grateful to you. And let me also put on record my deep appreciation of the extraordinary work that PIDE has been doing in recent years, and particularly in recent months, but after COVID-19, when the technology was used more extensively, and mashallah, the kind of subjects you've taken up are outstanding. You've also produced a vision report. So let me say that finally, PIDE is beginning to play the role we had in mind for many, many years. So thank you for having invited me. Now, the topic is a very important one, a vision for a forgotten economy. I mean, that is a very appropriate title. And today, the subject I'm going to be focusing on is a subject on which there is hardly any discussion. It is truly amazing that we are in the second half of the month of May, and the federal budget for the next financial year comes out usually in the second week of June. So we have hardly 3 weeks now between the preparation and the presentation of the federal budget, which is immediately followed by provincial budgets. There is no discussion anywhere in the media about the prospects for the next financial year. And we are all bogged down by the political altercations that are taking place. We are over-focused, if I may suggest, the issue of petroleum pricing and so on and so forth. And of course, I will discuss this in the context of the budgetary process. And therefore, perhaps the single most important financial event in any year, which is the presentation of the budget to the national parliament, has been absolutely nowhere in public or policy discussions. This is truly a tragedy. Now, why is this so important? This is particularly important because this year, which is about to come to an end, represents a year which probably can go down in history as one of the worst financial years in Pakistan's history. And why is that the case? The bottom line, before I try and describe the reasons why that is the case, is that we are likely to close the year with a deficit which is approaching 5,000 billion rupees. And if we relate it to the GDP with the base year of 2005-06, which is what we have been working with in our projections, because I frankly don't agree with the methodology used for the 2015-16 GDP projections. Living with the old set of projections at current prices, Pakistan will probably close this year with a consolidated fiscal deficit, federal and provincial governments combined, of 5,000 billion rupees. Now, just compare this with what the target was. The target, which was set in June last year, and there was a great deal of optimism at that time because the economy was reviving strongly, prices were down, the balance of payments problem had been largely resolved. We were all looking forward to a 5.5% to 6% growth. The development program was upscaled by almost 60 to 65%. And over the year, the whole picture has changed. And of course, there are many reasons, both domestic and international, for this. What was the deficit that we were targeting? We were targeting for a deficit of 3,440 billion. Ladies and gentlemen, we are over the target by almost 1,600 billion rupees. This is unbelievable. So the target originally set was 6.3% of the GDP. We are closing the year at 9% of the GDP. I've done a little bit of rounding. It might even be slightly more, but I've rounded it off to 9 so that everybody remembers it. And this is the largest history as a percentage of the GDP in the history of our beloved country. This is the magnitude of the problem. It is going to lead to a runaway growth in the size of the public debt. And when you consider the fact that the depreciation of the rupee will add almost 3,000 billion to the public debt by the end of the year, you are in effect seeing in 1 year an increase in government debt, more narrowly defined, of almost 8,000 billion rupees, which is incredible. That is something like 16% increase. This is why I felt that among the forgotten subjects, the timing of this discussion is crucial because we are at the limits of our financial insolvency. A lot of the focus has inevitably been on the external side, understandably, because dollars are involved. We don't have dollars. But the root cause perhaps of the rise in the current deficit, besides the international prices going up exponentially, one of the root causes traditionally has been very large budget deficit, which adds to aggregate demand and leads to mushroom growths in imports. So if you want to begin to tackle the structural problem, we have to start with the bigger black hole at this point in time, in rupees at least, which is your budget deficit. And as I said, hardly 3 weeks left, and I have not heard of a single meeting in the Ministry of Finance on preparation and finalization of the budget. Usually this process is completed by mid-May, and the requests for allocations have all been received by now, and the first picture of the budget begins to become available in the second half of May. I have a suspicion that this is not the case currently with the present government. Mind you, tomorrow, discussions start with the International Monetary Fund on the future of the fund program, particularly the completion of the 7th review. And clearly the fund is beginning to focus now, since we are in May, on actually effectively the 8th review also, which is the budget process and the shape and design of the forthcoming budget. Does the government have that kind of a vision already? I don't know. So let me start by quickly giving you the reasons why this year we have bust the budget by almost 1,500 billion. The first reason, of course, has been the precipitate increase in oil prices, starting from effectively from early this year. And the end result is that revenues from the petroleum levy, which we had very ambitiously targeted for 610 billion, will end the year with hardly 140 billion. So there's a shortage there already of 470 billion. The FBR revenues were performing exponentially, extremely well, 30 or more % growth rate. More recently, the growth rate has come down because suddenly one of the main sources of sales tax revenues, which is petroleum products, that has more or less also come to an end following the rise in prices. Today, in fact, as you all know, we are subsidizing the oil prices in Pakistan. So on the revenue side, you have these two major shortfalls, primarily linked to petroleum. And fortunately, with the rapid growth in imports, FBR revenues have been able to more or less compensate for it. And optimistically speaking, they might just get to 6,100 billion or come very close to it, short perhaps by a maximum of 100 billion. What's happening on the expenditure side? This is where there's another very big spillover. Believe it or not, on the current expenditure side, the spillover is close to 1 trillion rupees. I mean, this does not testify to very good public finance or financial management by the previous or the present government. 1,000 billion shortfall. Why? One, because at the time when the optimistic budget for this year was presented, interest rates were at an extremely low level of 7% policy rate. Since then, it has reached 12.25%. Inevitably, this is adding to the cost of debt servicing, probably to the tune of 300 to 400 billion by the end of the year, and the full impact we will see next year. The other two major areas where we have bust the budget. The first is, thank you, Nadeem, for that wonderful display. If anybody wants, please email me and I will send you a copy. Thank you so much. The other two major spillovers of expenditure. The first is subsidies, and this is partly due to this huge crisis today on the petroleum prices, where we are having to give a subsidy of 100 billion almost monthly, and that will probably add up to more than 300 billion by the end of the year. That's one of the big sources of the enhanced subsidy. But what we don't really focus on are the root causes of this runaway growth in subsidies, which is your power sector. There was a time when the subsidy we used to give about 5 years ago to the power sector was between 100 to 125 billion, mostly in the nature of a tariff differential subsidy. Today, the subsidy will be close to 600 to 700 billion. Part of the reason is that because of the severe liquidity constraints imposed by the mammoth increase in the circular debt, there is a need to reduce that problem by supplementary grants and injections into the power sector. And this is another reason why your current expenditure level goes up. Then the other problem is with grants, which are also beginning to explode, if I may use the word. And here again, there is a big reason for it. And that is the mushroom growth, and I use this term again, in contingent liabilities. Contingent liabilities are the guaranteed debt by the government of the debt taken by state-owned enterprises, either in the local rupee or in foreign currency. This is again grown and is approaching 2 to 2.5 trillion rupees. And every year, the guaranteed debt servicing in terms of interest payments, particularly, and repayment, is adding up to now 500 billion or so. So on every front, there is a runaway out of control tendency. So the end result is that your current expenditure is going to spill over by almost 1 trillion rupees. I mean, many, many years ago, we were in the government when we had a problem of about 50 to 60 billion. We used to have sleepless nights. Now we are talking of a spillover of 1 trillion rupees, and nobody has even bothered to mention this in the media or take it up seriously in policy discussions. So the end result, as I said, this year is we will have a budget deficit close to 1,500 billion above the targeted figure. This has happened after a big sacrifice. The optimism in the budget, when it was presented, there was a big increase targeted for in the spending on development at the federal level to 1,200, in fact, billion in the provinces and 900 billion at the federal level. And unfortunately, if there is one area we always sacrifice, that is development. And that is now going to be cut by at least 300 billion rupees. Otherwise, the deficit would have been 1,800 billion rupees. So instead of a target deficit of 6.3% of the GDP, which we had, of course, agreed with the IMF following the 6th review, now will stand at 9% of the GDP, the highest ever in history. The last time we had something close to that was 1819, when it was 8.9% the GDP, and the primary deficit could be as much as 2.6, 2.7% of the GDP. So this is all extremely worrying. Has the government prepared itself for bringing back sanity and stability into the public finance process? With all due respect, I have my doubts. The point is, there's too much focus on the immediate, literally the next day or the next week shortly. And this has been magnified by the growing perceptions about financial difficulties that we are facing as a country. And from what I'm told, there has not been much deep thinking on the budgetary process. In fact, as per the Public Financial Management Act, which was passed a few years ago, the government is expected to present before the National Parliament a budget strategy paper which presents the perspective for the next 3 years. This was a very good, sensible decision because it compelled the government to think strategically. But as has always been the case, it has already degenerated into an exercise in wishful thinking. And the last budget strategy paper said that by 2024-25, inshallah, Pakistan's fiscal deficit will be 4% of the GDP. And this year we are closing at 9. So what are we going to be looking forward to next year? Is the single most important policy question in my mind. And this will fundamentally affect the nature of our discussions with the International Monetary Fund in Doha starting tomorrow. So, my dear colleagues, what has the IMF agreed with the government following the 6th review in terms of next year's fiscal and budgetary targets? The previous government in December onwards, and this report came out in February after the 6th review, the staff report contains the projection for next year. Next year, we are expected to close the year 22-23 with a budget deficit consolidated of 4.5% of the GDP. What does that mean? We have to cut the deficit by half in 1 year. This is, to say the least, mathematically impossible, and I find it really strange that a government negotiating in the second half of the year, in the early part, would have agreed to such an ambitious target. And we are, in that sense, bound to this target during these discussions which are going to take place in Doha. With all due respect, having spent substantial amount of time researching on public finances, my own assessment is that with a deficit at 9% of the GDP this year, we will have virtually performed a miracle if we can bring the deficit down to 6% of the GDP next year, which is close to the target that we had this year, which was 6.3. 4.5 is mathematically and theoretically out of question. I don't know how you will be able to convince the IMF, but really this stretches the credibility to its absolute limits. And even to achieve this 6%, let me quickly tell you what needs to be done, and then I will indicate briefly some of the key policy measures that will need to be taken to bring in to achieve this target. The first thing is that we will have to raise the federal revenues total by 1,100 billion rupees. In real terms, this will be an increase of about 1,500 billion because the last year, the collection of sales tax and petroleum levy on petroleum products is now going to be 0. So your base is artificially inflated. So you have to cut it down now. If we do not have any taxation of petroleum products barring the customs duty, then the base figure has to be accordingly adjusted. So Pakistan will have to do something like 1,500 billion extra, which is a good, something like 25% of the level last year. This is the minimum increase in revenues required at a time when the economy is shaky. And of course, needless to say, I must compliment the Pakistan Bureau of Statistics. They're doing an extraordinary job these days. And I'm sure the Vice Chancellor of PIDE must be looking at those wonderful numbers. 26% growth in industry. MashaAllah, MashaAllah, MashaAllah. Why do we need to go to the IMF? The GDP rebasing, Pakistan's GDP suddenly is 16% higher. Wallah, that is equal to 3 years growth. I must say the National Statistical Council of the Pakistan Bureau of Statistics has done an outstanding job in improving our morale. So We will probably get there if we ask PBS to take over management of the budgetary process. Okay, so now what do we need to do on the current expenditure front? Inevitably, the debt servicing burden is going to be higher because we will now see at the minimum next year interest rates of 12.25% policy rate. And on the 23rd of May, the Monetary Policy Committee is about to meet and is likely, almost certainly, probably to consider some further enhancement in the policy rate. IMF says you have no scope for increasing your development spending. It remains at 600. In order to ensure that we get even to the 6%, leave alone the 4.5% target, we will have to sacrifice development once again next year. Unfortunately, you know, it's interesting, a 1% extra of the GDP spending on development, the multiplier, which has been produced by some of the economists at PIDE, and I've also produced it, is close to 1.7. So we have no injection of a growth stimulus from the budget, full stop. On the other hand, we'll have to go for additional taxation, substantial. As I said, my own assessment, and I hope the fund is reasonable, and I must say the fund is beginning to be inherently much more reasonable. Despite no move on the petroleum subsidy front, the IMF continues to have a meeting with Pakistan starting tomorrow. Thank you for that. We need that kind of a support at this time. Ladies and gentlemen, in my last section, I'd like to present quickly to you some of the proposals for generating that huge amount of additional revenue. How do we do it? Particularly when in the tax base, we no longer have petroleum products for sales tax and petroleum levy. This is a huge handicap. So the proposals are as follows. First, we have tried to control imports through various instruments, particularly exchange rate, to some extent interest rates. More recently, we have tried regulatory duties. We have also tried some import margin restrictions. Somehow or the other, it hasn't worked very well, and imports have continued to grow, not just in price terms, but also in volume terms. Please remember that. So we are back to the old mantra of forced import substitution. We have no other option but to bring back a tariff wall which is higher than what we have had currently. Believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, particularly on agriculture, Pakistan has by far the lowest import tariffs in South Asia. By far. We have opened too much in that sense. You know, you'll be amazed, Pakistan has an import duty on cotton, which is a huge 0%. India has a duty on agricultural products, which goes up to 60%. Can you hear me? Because the electricity is gone. Can you hear me?
We can hear you fine. We can hear you fine. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'm now talking in extreme temperatures. If I get provoked, please forgive me. We are having breakdowns every second hour. So the first thing is back to a somewhat higher import tariff wall to control imports. Currently, our tariff structure has 4 slabs, 5, 11, 16, and 20. We need to go back to the structure we had 7 or 8 years ago, which was a 6 slab structure from 5 to 30. This is what I would recommend. And we should also focus on tariff peaks and enhance tariff peaks, particularly on exotic luxury items, so that we can begin to control our non-essential imports. The exception to this tariff enhancement policy, 3 types of goods. 1, basic food items, we are importing edible oil, pulses, spices, vegetables, so on. The second category, medicines, and the third category, of course, fuel. Then I'm afraid Pakistan now has to start moving towards a more progressive income tax structure. And let me tell you, very interesting comparison of the personal income tax regime of Pakistan with that of India and Bangladesh, our two similar countries. The exemption limit in Pakistan is 600,000 rupees, which is approximately 3 times the per capita income. In India also, in Bangladesh, it's slightly lower, but not much lower. But the real surprise is with respect to the income level at which the maximum marginal tax rate applies. In India, it applies at an income level which is 10 times the per capita income level in the country. In Bangladesh, 8 times. In Pakistan, 300 times. 75 million rupees is your income when you begin to pay the highest marginal tax rate in this country. So the rich have had a wonderful deal. Imagine 300 times. So what we need to do is to make the personal tax structure much more progressive. Raise the exemption limit, reduce the rates at the middle class level, and then sharply raise them perhaps to a maximum. Instead of 75 million, the maximum should be reached, say, at about 20 million rupees annually. 20 million rupees. Even that is very high. And that would still be about 70 to 80 times per capita income. That's the other reform, and the fund has been pushing aggressively for it. And I completely agree with the fund on the need for a more progressive personal income tax structure in Pakistan. The other beauty is that in Pakistan, we have done something to reduce further the liability. We have partitioned income into parts. You have fixed and final levies on different components of the income so that total income is never taxed. You'd quietly pay small taxes in different types of income and get away. And so never is your global income assessed for taxation. Best example is interest income. It used to be 10% fixed and final. Now, fortunately, they've raised it to 15% final. But a person whose marginal tax rate is, say, 20, 25, he's getting a deal. On the other hand, the injustice is that a pensioner whose lifetime savings are in a bank deposit is paying the same 15%. So we need to have a better system. Then I can go on and on. Capital gains tax. There is a new concept in our beloved income tax law which says holding period. What does this mean? You hold an asset for a holding period of 4 years or 6 years, and then you encash it or sell it, 0 capital gains tax. This is unheard of. Because in fact, the accumulation of the incoming, yes, I agree, we should be taxing real capital gains. So the formula should index itself against inflation, but 0 taxation is totally out of the question. Then let me move quickly to the indirect taxes. There I could spend half an hour more on the direct taxation. I've already mentioned the need for going back to a somewhat higher import tariff regime in order to control our imports in a broad-based, discriminatory, careful fashion. The other move, which is about time we make it, India took many years to do it, but finally did it, and which is the move to a national value-added tax, whereby the sales tax on services, which is a provincial subject, and the sales tax on goods, which is a federal subject, somehow or the other are blended into one comprehensive value-added tax. Unfortunately, given the partition system today, we have huge problems of cascading. We have huge problems of pending repayments and duties. And worst thing which has happened is what I call the race to the bottom, whereby the provinces are successfully reducing their tax rates 15, 14, 13 down so that they can attract the tax base, which is mobile. This is totally counterproductive. So what we need perhaps is a kind of a reform which we saw in India. And today India's sales tax collections are 2 times as a percentage of the GDP of Pakistan. Finally, I can, as I said, talk more. We have no other option but to sequentially raise the petroleum prices. If we don't, are we going to then have a situation next year where just the subsidy on petrol, if the prices continue, today the prices hit $113. It's now the subsidy per liter is even higher. If we are unable to resolve this petrol price issue, are we going to target for an extra 1,200 or more billion rupees of subsidies? Is it take the country verge to bankruptcy? This is not possible. So in a sequential, staggered fashion, gradually, we have to move towards some sense of withdrawal of subsidy on petroleum products. I'm saying that maybe with no tax, I've already allowed for no taxation. And historically, 13 to 14% of tax revenues indirect were accruing from petroleum products. I'm willing to sacrifice that. But you cannot have a situation where you end up giving a 1,200 billion rupee subsidy on petroleum products. That is just not feasible. And it will take 5 minutes for our lenders to leave the table. So let me conclude by saying that Pakistan faces an incredibly formidable challenge on the domestic financial front, leave alone the external financial front. The two are linked because the domestic one tends to increase the external one. So that please, for God's sake, we must have much more discussion. I totally thank and admire the leadership of PIDE under the extraordinary leadership of Dr. Nadeem ul-Haq for having the courage and the vision to really focus on a vision for a forgotten economy. Thank you very much for your patient hearing.
Thank you, Hafiz. Thank you very much. Very nice, wonderful overview. Let me take up a few questions, then I'll go to the floor. Hafiz, very quickly, tell me, we've been in a death dance with the IMF for the last 75 years. We've had 23 programs divided by 75. That's almost one every 5 years. And I call it death dance because each time the problems seem to increase and we don't address them. Now, of course, we've been fooling the IMF, but is the IMF also being fooled by us or being conned? The fiscal issues, as you pointed out, the contingent liabilities you pointed out, the subsidies you pointed out, these are all growing issues. They didn't emerge overnight. They've been growing over the last decades. And somehow we have been unable to address them, and the IMF also has been unable to address them. So how do you feel about the fact that the death dance continues? And maybe the IMF, I've been in the IMF for many years, as you know IMF very well. Maybe the IMF is not the relevant agency for us to deal with, but maybe also it's our fault. We are not able to coherently either define a program or own it. Last night, we had a conversation with Adnan Mazrai. We had a 2-hour-long conversation with Adnan Mazrai. And he was also saying that the IMF failed us. IMF has been too lenient, and maybe we have been the spoiled child that takes advantage of a caring or a lenient parent. But this relationship is not going well. And we are not going to own up to our responsibilities and our problems. You pointed some of them out. But tell me, I mean, this government, whatever government that comes in, what do you suggest that they do? You've written the Charter of Economy. What do they do to take immediate action and do deep structural reforms so that we can get out of the IMF death dance and take ourselves forward? So what are the key reforms that might be necessary? And in terms of the IMF, what would you advise them? What tough love can they show us?
This is a very fundamental question. I also spent some time dealing with the IMF many years ago. In fact, I contributed to the negotiations in the PPP program era, if you remember. And earlier on, of course, when I was in the government. You see, part of the problem has been the somewhat politicized nature of the fund program, not from our side, but from the fund side. And this has been a product of none other than the wonderful Treasury Office in Washington. I don't want to be more explicit. You do understand. Take the program from 2013 to 2016. It was a gift program to the previous government, which was pursuing an agenda very much in line with what Treasury or the government which has this Treasury wanted. 16 waivers. Can you have a program with any modicum of credibility if the performance criteria or the structural benchmarks are just completely ignored, and the executive board of the IMF goes ahead and gives these waivers? Now it is the other extreme. Now they're being exceptionally tough, and the last meeting in Washington, I'm told, was brutal, both by the Treasury as well as by the IMF staff. Suddenly now I see a little breakthrough, and that is the willingness to continue talking to Pakistan, despite the inability to fulfill the condition of beginning to remove the petroleum levy. I'm sorry, the petroleum subsidy. You see, my own dream at the fag end of our lives, and that is why I wrote this book with my students, MPhil and PhD students, Charter of the Economy. The current Prime Minister of Pakistan had the vision when he was the leader of the opposition in 2018. In his first speech, he mentioned the need for a kind of consensus on a structural charter of the economy to which all parties subscribe to, which creates a sense of, if you like, less uncertainty and more a sense of direction, and in that sense significantly promotes both the domestic and private investment. My motivation to do this book was exactly to just initially define the key issues, identify the parameters of the problem, the magnitude of the problem, the different options for solving this problem. It is a very humble exercise. It was an exercise in trying to set the agenda for a quick beginning and a rapid process towards the emergence of a charter of economy. And I'm grateful to the Honorable President of Pakistan, who asked for many copies. I personally have given a copy to the major party heads, but there has been no action in terms of a move towards charter of the economy. Vice Chancellor साहब, बात ये है, इस वक्त 11 parties बैठी हुई हैं. Isn't this a wonderful time with 70% of the votes with them, and hopefully attract the remaining 30% to join them in developing a consensus on a vision which focuses on growth and removal of the structural impediments to a beloved country. But that opportunity does not appear at this point to be availed. And this is truly a tragedy. And believe me, I worry all the time. Let me stop here and look forward to other questions.
Pasha Sahab, so एक और सवाल आपसे पूछूं. You're the foremost expert in public finance. We should all recognize that. मुझे लोग कहते हैं कि तुम nepotism practice करते हो, और मैं उनको हमेशा कहता हूँ yes ये nepotism है, पर मेरे दोस्त अच्छे हैं, मैं उनको बुला लेता हूँ. मैं क्या करूँ अगर दोस्त बुरे होते तो बात नहीं. तो Pasha Sahab, you're the foremost expert on public finance, but let me ask you a simple question. Tax policy पे आपने बड़ी अच्छी बातें की. We need to introduce progression. We also need to get rid of nuisance taxation. ये जो हमने 1000 withholding tax लगाया. In fact, you and Karda did a very good paper on that. कि जी इनका क्या फायदा. Let me ask you, ये जो हमने इतना complicated tax policy बनाई हुई है और हमने टैरिफ रेजीम को, मेरा ख्याल अब एवरेज टैरिफ तो मेरा 30 से ऊपर 45% पे तकरीबन चला गया है. रेगुलेटरी ड्यूटीज अगर आप इंक्लूड करें, अगर आप सर्च चार्जेस इंक्लूड करें, क्योंकि हम सिर्फ टैरिफ तो नहीं लगा रहे, हम तो 2-3 किस्म की चीजें लगा रहे हैं. तो क्या हमारी ओपननेस होनी चाहिए कि नहीं होनी चाहिए, और हमारी टैक्स पॉलिसी क्या सिंप्लीफाई नहीं हो सकती कि हम 2-3 टैक्सेस पे हैं. और एक और चीज है कि डॉक्यूमेंटेशन पॉलिसी जो है वो और भी उससे अजीब किस्म की है. जैसे मुझे लोग बताते हैं कि उनके पास बहुत सारे एम्प्लॉइज हैं जस्ट टू डॉक्यूमेंट एंड पे टैक्सेस. वीएटी की जो रेजीम है उनके ऊपर, वीएटी नहीं सॉरी विदहोल्डिंग की जो रेजीम है, वीएटी नहीं सॉरी विदहोल्डिंग की रेजीम जो है उनके ऊपर इतना बर्डन लगा रही है फॉर टैक्स कलेक्शन का. तो हमने जो चेक किया, हमने एक रिपोर्ट की स्लज पे, वो तो हमें बता रहे हैं लोग कि यार इस पे तो हम लोग बैठ गए बिल्कुल. तो इसके बारे में आपका क्या ख्याल है, टैक्स पॉलिसी सिंप्लीफिकेशन पे तुम्हें बताएं.
आपकी बात बहुत मुनासिब है. बात दरअसल ये है कि complexity sometimes is consciously introduced as a mechanism for increasing discretionary powers of you know who, tax collectors. मैं तो इस हद तक ये कहता रहा हूं कि आपने बिल्कुल ठीक फरमाया. हमारे इंपोर्ट्स पर बेसिक ड्यूटी, रेगुलेटरी ड्यूटी, income tax on import, so on and so forth. In some cases, there are even 4 points of collection on imports. ये regulatory duty का निज़ाम और ये आपका जो assessment है for purposes of withholding, देखिए ये सरासर नामुनासिब. और now that if we go for a reform of our tax structure, you need to just have one tariff rate, which is what we call the MFN tariff. And for certain cases where you have preferential agreements, yes, of course, like with China, you will need to have a separate structure. That is fine. Every country has that. But for the normal imports, we need to have one tariff. Transparent, absolutely clear. You will be amazed the kind of protection we have given to sugar. It will take you months to go through the SROs to see how skillfully behind the scenes sugar imports have been retarded to give much more protection to our sugar manufacturers. As compared to that, cotton is on zero duty. Imagine. So the vested interest aspect has to be taken care of also. On the income tax side, you see, I am supposed to be the father of the withholding tax regime. I thought of only one tax, and that was the idea of a taxation on electricity bills to, in fact, penetrate into the informal sector. By the time I left, we had maximum 2 or 3 withholding taxes. In the last 20 years, we are now up to 73 withholding taxes. It is almost half the income tax law. This is absurd, absolutely wrong. And sometimes it is so oppressive. As I gave you an example, that a retired pensioner is paying 15% on the small interest income that he gets. It's completely unacceptable. So we need to simplify the income tax law. I had even proposed that in order to promote documentation, why don't we simply agree that for the first 5 years that you file a return, we will not be assessing you. You come, file a simple return, and inshallah, after 5 years, we can begin to see what happens. I did this once, and then of course, after I left, because FBR doesn't like to give this kind of a dispensation, it was withdrawn. But believe me, simplification, transparency, removal of the vested interest angle. And I'll give you one example, which probably was the cause of one of the removals of the FBR chairperson. Today, agricultural income is a very popular way of evading payment of taxes by saying that your assets yield agricultural income. So the law was about to be introduced on deemed income. linked to your land holdings. And this was the reason why one chairman was asked to go home. So there are not only the simplification, transparency problem, the problem is the, if I may use a strong expression, capture by vested interests of the tax laws. And this is what we need to begin to look at.
Pasha sab, SROs, according to even the FPR calculation, the latest report hai, कहते हैं 1.3 trillion hai. That means tax exemptions, tax expenditures are 1.3 trillion. Now, of course, we can quibble with the methodology, it may be a little bit less, agreed, but they're still substantial. उसके साथ एक और भी चीज है, अगर हम टैक्स जीडीपी रेशियो देखें, ये डोनर्स कहते हैं टैक्स जीडीपी रेशियो कम है, बट एक और भी हम चीज देखते हैं कि जो रेगुलेटरी बर्डन है, जो हमने अभी कैलकुलेट किया पीआईडी में, रेगुलेटरी बर्डन, we've just taken about 20 activities and we find that the regulatory burden could be as high as 39%. दूसरा हमने फुटप्रिंट ऑफ द गवर्नमेंट कैलकुलेट की. फुटप्रिंट मींस कि किधर किधर गवर्नमेंट बैठी हुई है, क्या चीजें प्राइसेस फिक्स कर रहे हैं, क्या एसेट्स कंट्रोल कर रहे हैं. दैट केम आउट टू बी ऑलमोस्ट 70 to 80% of GDP. So if the government, like for example, government has construction companies that dominate, the government has agricultural market that dominate. So once we take all this into account, तो एक तो रेगुलेटरी बर्डन बहुत है, दूसरा फुटप्रिंट बहुत ज्यादा है, और तीसरा ये है कि ये एग्जेम्पशंस मार रही हैं और इसका इंडस्ट्री पे जो कॉस्ट आ रहा है. फॉर एग्जांपल इफ आई लुक एट द इंडस्ट्रियल स्ट्रक्चर इन पाकिस्तान, वो तो पिछले 30-40 साल में चेंज ही नहीं हुआ. और इसके साथ एक रिलेटेड सवाल जो आपके साथ है वो ये है कि हमारी इन्वेस्टमेंट रेट, पाशा साहब, ये तो 15-16% के दरमियान रहती है थ्रू आउट आवर हिस्ट्री. इज दिस sustainable? Should we be thinking of this?
आपने जो पहले काम किया था ग्रोथ रेट में, पाइड ने बड़ा मुनासिब काम किया था. Of course, you were optimistic about the growth rate, about 7 to 9. I thought maybe we will do well if we get up to 6. You see, I was motivated by this huge investment constraint of Pakistan. This is a remarkable country. You know, the current rate is down to 13.6. And if you have, and historically, whenever we do research on Pakistan, we take an input-output ratio, a capital output ratio of close to 3. So Pakistan's potential growth rate is 4.5, and in good years only 5. And that is what we have actually seen in the trend numbers. You see, the issue is, despite this constraint, and may I make a humble request to you, please, in your institute, there are bound to be people with a strong national income accounts background and statistical approach. The numbers on the rebased GDP of Pakistan that have been produced by the Pakistan Bureau of Statistics need to be looked at very carefully. I've written a lot and I'll send you my writings on them. And please, I'd be grateful if you could have an independent assessment of the value of these numbers, and I would ensure that this gets to the right quarters in the government. You see, declaring that suddenly overnight Pakistan's economy is 16.3% larger. And you know, it's good news is that Pakistan has caught up once again with Bangladesh because of this. Our per capita income now has exceeded Bangladesh once again. Mashallah, mashallah. But the amount of fiddling that is going on is something which needs to be investigated, and a thoroughbred institute like PIDE needs to have a look at it. But I totally agree with you. You look at our rankings in ease of doing business. You know, in ease of doing business, the two areas where we do the worst is the number of tax levies, which run into dozens, or other levies, non-tax levies, and regulatory interventions. You're absolutely 100% right. And this is an area which is a plus area for the country. But the bureaucracy, and particularly the lower echelons of the bureaucracy who are at the ground level, it is in their vested interest to continue with this for obvious reasons. And one had hoped that the arrival of a new leader like Mr. Imran Khan, who was talking about improved governance, would have led to significant improvement, but we don't see that happening as of now.
Pasha sahab, final question let me ask you. with our investment rate so low, and as you said, with our potential growth rate between 4 and 5%, and with our demographic push, we are looking for disaster, either in the short term or the long term. What role do you think growth should play in our adjustment? IMF के programs जो हैं, they have been very recessionary throughout our history. And हमारा growth पे focus कोई नहीं. You've been deputy chairman, you know better than me. कि planning commission तो मर चुकी है. And quite frankly, हम कोई long term planning तो करते नहीं है. और हमारा सारा focus रहता है. आपने बजट की बात की, बड़ी अच्छी बात की कि बजट हमारा नहीं बन रहा. बट क्वाइट फ्रेंकली हमारा बजट तो एक किस्म की फिक्शन ही होती है, बिकॉज हर 3 महीने के बाद मिनी बजट आ जाता है. We don't respect our budgetary boundaries, as you saw. Okay, जी गवर्नमेंट ने उठा के पेट्रोलियम लेवी खत्म कर दी, पेट्रोलियम की प्राइस एडजस्ट करनी बंद कर दी. I mean, despite the fact that we had a budget in place, they kind of threw it out of the window. I mean, if we had a serious budget, this matter should have gone to parliament. There should have been some discussion, debate, but it never happened, and it doesn't happen. So let's face it, हमारी budget की discussion parliament में बड़ी कमजोर होती है. तो एक तो we don't have fiscal discipline. दूसरा ये है कि finance ministry had taken all the power, and there is no focus on a long-term growth policy. In a sense, am I correct in saying that growth has been reduced to a distant, maybe 5th or 6th, maybe 20th objective, क्योंकि कोई objective हमारा growth का नजर नहीं आता. और दूसरी चीज है investment पे हमारी कोई तवज्जो नहीं है. तो क्या ये इन variables को हमें policy में ऊपर लाना चाहिए और इन पे क्या करना चाहिए? Thank you.
That's a very good question and a very profound question, which can only come from Dr. Nadeem ul-Haq. I'll give you one small example. In the model that we have built here at the university with the 3 or 4 PhD students, we ran through a simulation where we raised the public sector development program by 1% of the GDP and ran it through the system. And it led to a rise in the GDP of 1.7%, which is a reasonable ratio. Perhaps it could have been higher, but we at least got 1.7% extra growth rate. And what was fascinating is that 1.7% extra growth rate more or less financed through various mechanisms in the system, the rise in the outlay on development. This is exactly the kind of argument you're making. A pro-growth of the right kind, a right kind of growth strategy can finance itself. The other point that I'd like to make is, we had designed a whole set of incentives, and I'm sorry to say that during the late 90s, when we were in the government, we had managed to introduce some very skillfully designed investment incentives. Subsequent governments, particularly the last government, withdrew all of them, partly under IMF pressure. What is interesting is that, again, at some stage, I can show you the results of the simulations. You may lose some revenue through the fiscal incentive, and this is what the so-called tax expenditure report, which you referred to, talks about, of the FBR. But what you don't realize is that the investment, if it augments the tax base, may not give you the direct tax revenue for a few years due to the tax holiday. But what it does is that it expands the tax base and gives you additional sales tax and other revenues. And these are never taken into account in working out the returns from investment incentives. One of my students is currently doing a PhD on this issue. So we have to preserve incentives. We have to simplify the signals in the system. Unfortunately, last 2-3 years under the IMF pressures, we have withdrawn most of them. And finally, let me say that the returns to investment in people, huge, and we never thought about it. So we should have a session sometime where the appropriate kind of growth strategy can be self-sustaining and propelling growth. What is that ingenious combination of strategic instruments that will give us that? I've just given you one example of the investment scheme, investment incentive scheme. There are many other examples which we have been working on. And inshallah, I totally agree with your approach that a appropriate, sustainable pro-growth strategy. Agreed.
Pasha, the final question from me, मुझे ये बताइए कि हमारी capacity to make policy and negotiate. Would you agree with me? I'll be a little provocative. कि हमारी हुकूमत में ये skills, policy making skills और policy negotiation skills और financial market skills और ये जो सारे skills हैं, ये बहुत कमजोर हैं. We have really not been able to develop the economist cadre to take on these responsibilities. We keep looking for a chief economist. We keep trying to build capacity through some consultants here or there. Would you say my assessment is correct, or would you say that I'm sort of being too harsh?
No, you're not being harsh at all. There was a time way back in the 80s and 90s when we did have requisite capacity. In fact, if you remember, the first IMF program was negotiated by none other than Dr. Mahbubul Haq, who was then the minister in 1988. The point is, and yesterday I had delivered a lecture at the National School of Public Policy, the National Management College in Lahore. And I made this point that the bureaucracy has begun to play an extraordinarily passive role. They follow whatever instructions are given by the bosses, the political bosses. There is no sense of dialogue, no sense of honorably presenting the pros and cons, highlighting the implications, because they're worried that they might be removed. So this kind of milieu has led to a class of civil servants and bureaucrats who do not prize technical capacity very much, but on the other hand, value obedience and submission to high authority. Yes, there has to be discipline, but you can certainly have a civilized dialogue. Today, believe me, in the previous discussions with the fund, and I know all about it, the fund was exasperated at the highest level in their negotiations. The quality of the arguments presented and the way those arguments were presented was very inappropriate. We have to take on the IMF at the technical level also. And that helps us in building a stronger case for the overall program, if you like. Like, for instance, if discuss the tax policy, we should have numbers, we should show what the exemptions are, we should be able to show the impact of incentives, we should be able to show how simplification produces results. It should be based on evidence-based research and analysis. I totally agree with you. And one thing I will tell you, with all honesty, forgive me because you're a former IMF official, Stiglitz was absolutely right when he said that the best PhDs don't go to IMF and the World Bank, they stay in universities.
Asha sahab, isi se related question.
Can I just finish my sentence?
Sorry, go ahead.
When I used to negotiate with the fund, I can say this with pride, they used to come back to me later on and say, you're always quoting elasticities and things like that. We really don't know how to react to this. I said, this is technical discussion. This is what we need in Pakistan. Yes, please go ahead.
Good point. But this comes to another question, which kind of, I think, is close to your heart and mind too, since you always return to academia, since that's your anchor. मुझे एक और चीज पे थोड़ी हैरानगी होती है, maybe again I'm going excessive, so please check me. We have 260 universities, but they don't seem to play any role in this. We have many impact factor articles. But yet, in all this discussion, all the points that you made, and very good points, and I appreciate all that you said, हमारी universities तो ये research नहीं कर रही हो, ना हमें बता रही है कुछ. तो should there be a protagonist in this? इसके साथ related question ये है कि हमारी finance ministry, planning में जो भी है institutions, public sector की, वो university से बात ही नहीं करना चाहती. तो फिर यूनिवर्सिटीज कैसे दिलेर होंगी? और रिलेटेड ये कि वो तो सारा डोनर से काम करवा रही है। तो ये एक किस्म की एपिस्टेमोलॉजी जो पॉलिसी की है, इस पे थोड़ा सा कमेंट करें कि पॉलिसी अगर ओनरशिप हो और घर की पॉलिसी बने, उसमें यूनिवर्सिटीज का कोई रोल होना चाहिए कि नहीं होना चाहिए? और हमारी यूनिवर्सिटीज, क्योंकि हमारे बच्चे भी हैं यहाँ सुन रहे हैं आपको, पीएचडी वाले, उनको रिसर्च थीसिस में कैसे सोचना चाहिए, कैसे टॉपिक्स चूज करने चाहिए, ये भी आपके जैसे बंदे से आई थिंक कमेंट्स बहुत अच्छे होंगे।
देखिए, बहुत अहम सब्जेक्ट है, चूंकि अल्लाह ने मुझे इज्जत ये दी कि मैं कराची यूनिवर्सिटी का, जो हमारे मुल्क की तकरीबन एक बहुत बड़ी यूनिवर्सिटी का वाइस चांसलर भी रहा हूँ। देखिए, पब्लिक यूनिवर्सिटीज के साथ जो मसला है, एक तो आपने इसको एक सिंबल ऑफ फेवर बना दिया है कि किसी एक छोटे डिस्ट्रिक्ट में एक यूनिवर्सिटी खड़ा कर देंगे तो लोग कहेंगे वाह जी वाह, दिस इज अ टेस्टिमनी ऑफ योर लव फॉर दैट डिस्ट्रिक्ट। The number of universities we have today in Pakistan, public and private, the number you just quoted, is only just under half the number of universities in India. And India has a population which is at least 6 times larger. There has been a ruthless proliferation of universities which are seen as a gift to a particular area. Construction ho rahi hai, khoobsurat building nazar aa rahi hai. Do you know that out of the 264 universities, probably 200 or more do not have the faculty, leave alone being able to do research? Is this spreading thin? And now, to top it all, University Grants Commission has become a stepchild, certainly in the previous government for various reasons. And only a few days ago, the present Vice Chancellor of the University of Karachi rang me up and he said, 2 साल से हमने अपने प्रोफेसरों को, रिटायर्ड प्रोफेसरों को पेंशन नहीं दिया है। ये हालत है आपकी यूनिवर्सिटीज। इस वक्त there is a state of virtual collapse in public higher education. And you're absolutely right. I've only wished to God that we would get out of this political dispensation of having a university in some of the most backward districts of Pakistan just to please the people. Universities have to be very important. There was a time when people like us in universities, in ARC and PIDE have been used, but these are very few cases. And surely there exists capacity elsewhere in other universities. And in a way, my own feeling is that the role you are now playing, PIDE, which is a very outgoing role and involving young faculty from all over the country, is an outstanding role. And you're creating a community, inshallah, that will then become more aggressive and start talking on policy, writing on policy, and playing a role in the media on policy. Wonderful.
Thank you, Ji. Let me go to the floor now. Nadeem Saab, boliye.
Assalamu alaikum, sir. My name is Nadeem. I'm PhD scholar from IBA Karachi. It was really wonderful to listen both of you. Sir, my question is that whenever we talk about fiscal challenges, we only focus on collecting higher taxes, and we normally ignore inefficient, counterproductive expenditures like on SEOs, deadlock capital in form of state-owned lands, and spending such as on clubs, etc. My question is, why should I pay a higher tax just to finance these kind of expenditures? Why not cutting these expenditures first, put this money in a productive way, and then asking people to pay more taxes?
Ji Hafiz.
I didn't have the time. My presentation, half of it was actually focusing on economy and expenditure, because I've already highlighted to you that we are spending 1,500 billion rupees more than we should because of limited time. But now that you've given me an opportunity, let me highlight. You're absolutely right. Look at the federal government. After the 18th Amendment, we thought somehow or the other that there'd be a process of devolution and the provinces would become more active, take on many of the functions, but that has not happened. Today, your federal government has a minimum of 40 divisions or ministries. And when I was asked many years ago to do a downsizing exercise, I was able to conclude on very careful analysis that the federal government then, at the time when it was even bigger, could make do with 12 ministries. That's it. The proliferation is due, of course, to absorb senior civil servants. So there is always a vested interest angle in this. More importantly, we have 200 autonomous departments and attached autonomous bodies and attached departments. God knows what these 200 are doing. A simple exercise, maybe we could request Dr. Haq on behalf from the government, a request could go to him. Please do simple zero-based budgeting of these 200 entities. Bas. You do this and you will end up finding out how much slack there is in the system. Then there is a whole area of expenditure project management. Today, you will be pleased to know that the size of the PSDP at the federal level is 600 billion, and the throw forward is only 8,000 billion. A typical project will take 12 to 15 years to complete. You are stretched too thin, 1,048 projects to please everybody. Result, delays in implementation, massive cost overruns. इतने simple से solutions है, मैं तो हैरान होता हूँ. But there is this political process which plays a role. आपको किसी एक नई पार्टी को आप ले आए हैं अपने साथ, आपको वहां के जगह में कुछ खुशी करनी है, उनकी प्रोजेक्ट ने आप बना दिया. 8,000 billion throw forward, 1,048 projects. क्या मजाक बनाया हुआ आपने? So आपकी बात 100% वैलिड है, और इन द फ्यूचर अगर वो चाहें तो मैंने जो किताब लिखी उसमें ज्यादा फोकस मेरा एक्चुअली एक्सपेंडिचर मैनेजमेंट पे है. बट चूंकि बजट पे बात हो रही थी, शॉर्ट रन में टैक्स पॉलिसी पे बात करना था, तो इसलिए मैंने इस पे बात किया.
वेरी गुड, थैंक यू. आलिया खान. आलिया खान.
जी शुक्रिया नदीम. पाशा साहब, अस्सलाम वालेकुम. मैं 2 सवाल आपसे इंटरलिंक्ड पूछूंगी. एक तो ये कि जो इमीडिएट इस वक्त इशू नजर आ रहा है वो IMF का प्रोग्राम रिज्यूम करना लगता है, तो आप कितने ऑप्टिमिस्टिक हैं कि जो आई सपोज कल से जो नेगोशिएशंस शुरू हो रही हैं उसमें गवर्नमेंट को खुद भी, या जो भी मैं कहूँगी जो नेगोशिएशन करेंगे वो पार्ट, मतलब दे रिप्रेजेंट ओनली वन पार्टी एट द मोमेंट रियली, वो कितने खुद इस मामले में क्लियर हैं कि उनको क्या स्टैंड लेना चाहिए? क्योंकि जो इस वक्त उनकी बौखलाहट है उससे तो ये जाहिर होता है कि होमवर्क तो नहीं किया हुआ था कि अगर कोalition गवर्नमेंट इतनी बड़ी बन जाती है तो किस तरीके से इकोनॉमिक मैनेजमेंट की जाएगी. और उससे लिंक सवाल ये है कि अगर ये टॉक्स फेल होती हैं तो फिर पाकिस्तान के पास क्या ऑप्शंस हैं, स्पेशली अगर इलेक्शंस के ऊपर कंसेंसस नहीं होता और इस गवर्नमेंट को बजट प्रेजेंट करना पड़ता है. थैंक यू.
बहुत अहम सवाल किए हैं आलिया, एज यूजुअल, and they need a very serious and well thought out response. मेरी अपनी राय ये है कि इस वक्त पाकिस्तान में 2 फाइनेंस मिनिस्टर्स हैं. एक हमारे जो ऑफिशियली नॉमिनेटेड फाइनेंस मिनिस्टर हैं और दूसरा लंदन में बैठे हुए हैं, नाम नहीं ले रहा. और फंडामेंटल डिफरेंस इन थिंकिंग. One of them is saying renegotiate a new program. The other is saying let's carry on, finish the 7th review, and at best extend it by 1 more year and get an extra $2 billion. दूसरी तरफ एक कह रहे हैं कि इंक्रीमेंटल बेसिस पर पेट्रोलियम प्राइसेस को बढ़ाएं इसलिए कि अनसस्टेनेबल है. दूसरी तरफ राय ये है कि इसमें गुंजाइश नहीं है. एक तो within the dominant party there are 2 views, ideological views almost. and frequently expressed in the media, which leads to further uncertainty and confusion. दूसरी तरफ पार्टीज इतने हैं कि पहले उनको जिस तरह मैंने कहा था कम से कम एक कंसेंसस बेसिक मेजर पॉलिसीज पे एग्रीमेंट कर लेना चाहिए था soon after takeover, because they took over at a time when it was almost inevitable that they will have to present the annual budget, even if they want to have an early election, because a caretaker government cannot present a budget. Caretaker government can only operate on a day-to-day basis. And quite frankly, the expectation that a caretaker government can be brought in to act as the suckers, if I can use that word, and take horrible, difficult, tough decisions, that is not an option, because it will be rejected by the people. They have no credibility. A caretaker government is there to simply keep the process going during the elections, not big decisions or policies to be taken. So, but I must say, I am sensing one little positive development. I see the IMF not being as reticent as it was, say, 2 months ago. And its willingness to continue with the dialogue in Doha, despite a blatant statement to the effect that there will be no increase in the foreseeable future in petrol prices, is an indication of some flexibility which has come in. Maybe, as I said, it comes through a particular channel which I've described earlier. The point, however, is, just as the Vice Chancellor argued, we need to be very clear on what is the strategy we want to present. Now, if you see, as I told you, we are going in with a agreed budget for next year numbers, which has zero nominal growth in the public sector development program. You're just basically not going to expand productive capacity. As it is, Dr. Nadeem has talked about the low level of investment. Our public investment has shrunk from 4.5% to hardly 2% of the GDP. How are you going to increase your infrastructure and create productive capacity? Yes, if still there is a breakdown of a fundamental nature, and the 7th or 8th reviews process does not proceed further, Pakistan is in deep trouble. And while we have been giving second best options like enhancement in import tariffs and so on, one agency which is now autonomous, and I don't want to be explicit purposely, has actually come up with a program. They have come up with a program. An autonomous agency of Pakistan, newly autonomous, with a plan for physical ban on imports. Admission to the effect that other policies are not working. So God forbid, in the event there is a breakdown and the pipeline more or less gets shut of funding to Pakistan, we will have to do what Sri Lanka has been doing for a considerable period of time, almost 2 years. Import bans or quotas. Extreme measures will be required.
Thank you. Ji Sameer Ahmed. Sameer.
जी अस्सलाम वालेकुम. Thank you very much, Dr. Pasha, Dr. Nadeem. मेरा सवाल हमेशा वो political economy side पे आ जाता है जी कि we get together and we analyze problems and we say here are the solutions, and it seems to me that we remain unheard because the political dispensation has its own compulsions and constraints and so forth. And right now we're seeing an extreme example: oncoming train, fuel subsidies, and we're just paralyzed. But even in normal times, it seems to me that we are not able to get ourselves heard. Now, what is it that we have to do to effectively lobby the political system how do we make a voice heard? How do we become effective? I mean, all of these solutions, analyses, to a certain extent, they've been done to death, but we keep doing the same thing and nobody seems to even care.
I understand where you're coming from. There's a high degree of disillusionment on the part of the intellectual component of our society, and it's understandable. To some extent, we have not presented a sufficiently well-prepared, well-documented case, and it is for the first time that I see our elite premier institution, PIDE, trying to do that. Historically, PIDE had been a very introverted organization and did not lead to this kind of dialogue. It has to be disseminated much more. You see, the problem in Pakistan, like other societies, is a strong element of state capture by the elite. And unless you begin to demonstrate that, our Human Development Report, for the first time, United Nations, UNDP Human Development Report was on inequality last year. And because of the UN umbrella, we had the courage to quantify exactly what are the privileges and what do they cost Pakistan. Please have a look at that. And this report had a huge impact, and I am embarrassed to tell you this. I have been under pressure. I have been sometimes told that I am crossing the limit. But I've done it at the back end of my life because we have to now reveal to the public and the people what the reality is. Please have a look at that report, and I would appreciate very much your reaction. Thank you.
The last question, Shahid Mahmood. Shahid? Shahid, unmute. Shahid Waheed. Shahid Waheed. Ji Shahid sir.
My name is Mohammad Shahid Waheed and I'm PhD scholar at Applied Economic Research Center. सर मेरा सवाल जो है वो सब टैक्सेशन ऑन एक्सपोर्ट और इंपोर्ट के हवाले से है. टैक्स रेवेन्यू हमें एक्सपोर्ट, चूँकि एक्सपोर्ट्स पे हमारे टैक्स है नहीं और होना भी नहीं चाहिए. साइड बाय साइड हम अगर देखें फ्लेक्सिबल एक्सचेंज रेट की पॉलिसी जो है एक्सपोर्ट एनहेंसमेंट के लिए, लेकिन हमारे इंपोर्ट्स जो हैं वो हर साल एक्सपोर्ट के डबल ही होते जा रहे हैं और इंटरेस्ट रेट कितना ही हाई क्यों नहीं होता जा रहा, हमारे इंपोर्ट कम ही नहीं होते जा रहे. और पहले तो ये कि हमारे रिसर्च में अभी तक मुझे तो लिटरेचर में ये चीज़ नहीं मिल रही कि हमारे एक्सपेंडिचर जो है उसमें शेयर हमारे इम्पोर्टेड गुड के कितने हैं और एक्सपोर्टेड गुड कितने हैं. मुश्किल काम है. लेकिन हमारा डेवलपमेंट प्रोजेक्ट
नहीं है पता. प्लीज एक्सप्लेन, किस चीज में हमें शेयर नहीं पता है.
हमारे जो एक्सपेंडिचर्स हैं, हाउस होल्ड एक्सपेंडिचर्स, उसमें हमारे इम्पोर्टेड गुड्स, इम्पोर्टेड शेयर कितना है इम्पोर्टेड गुड्स के और एक्सपोर्ट के कितने हैं. कि हमारे लोकल जो हम जो चीज़ कंज्यूम कर रहे हैं उसमें हम एक्सपोर्ट कितना कर रहे हैं और इम्पोर्ट, यानी हमारे लोकली प्रोड्यूस्ड प्रोडक्ट्स कितने हैं और इम्पोर्ट कितना कर रहे हैं. लेकिन अगर हम डेवलपमेंट प्रोजेक्ट्स का हम निकालना चाहें, फॉर एग्जांपल सीपेक का, अगर हम सीपेक नहीं सॉरी ये BRTs और ये मेट्रो बसेस बारे जो हम कर रहे हैं, अभी तक हम ये चीज़ नहीं निकाल पा रहे कि हमारे लोकली मतलब उसमें इम्पोर्टेड जो गुड्स हैं वो कितने हैं या इम्पोर्ट के जो एक्सपेंडिचर्स हैं वो कितने हैं. इससे हमें असल में फ़ायदा ये मिल जाएगा कि हमारी सीमेंट इंडस्ट्री, हमारी स्टील इंडस्ट्री और जितने भी इनपुट्स ये BRTs और जितने बड़े बड़े डेवलपमेंट प्रोजेक्ट्स में यूज़ हो रहे हैं वो हमारे लोकली चीज़ें. लेकिन हम तकरीबन नवाज शरीफ के दौर से ये BRT और मेट्रो स्टार्ट हुई हैं, लेकिन अभी तक हमने बस की जो इंडस्ट्री है वो अभी तक पाकिस्तान में हमने नहीं बनाई. और चूंकि ये हम इंपोर्ट करते हैं और इंपोर्ट पे टैक्स भी होता है, तो हमें ये चीज़ समझ नहीं आ रही कि ये जो फ्लेक्सिबल इंटरेस्ट रेट की पॉलिसी है, एक्सचेंज रेट की पॉलिसी है, वो क्या इसलिए तो नहीं है कि FBR को टैक्स कलेक्शन चूंकि फिर ज़्यादा मिलेगा, अगर एक चीज़ बाहर से इंपोर्ट महंगी हो रही है तो उसमें शेयर भी महंगा होगा. और नाम उसको एक्सपोर्ट ओरिएंटेड और एक्सपोर्ट
ठीक है।
एनहांसमेंट पॉलिसी कहते हैं।
ठीक है, पाशा साहब को जवाब दें। चलिए
मैं जल्दी से जवाब दे देता हूं। बात यह है कि आप दरअसल मुझे लग रहा है कि ज्यादा इंपोर्ट सब्स्टिट्यूशन पॉलिसी की बात कर रहे हैं। और हुआ ये कि पाकिस्तान में ओवर टाइम हमने ये सोचा कि हमारी इकोनॉमी को ओपन अप करें, लिबरलाइज करें, और इस तरह से एक्सपोर्ट्स को आप एक पॉजिटिव देते हैं सिग्नल, और availability improves. And for example, almost 40 to 45% of our textile export inputs are imported even today, including cotton, strangely enough. आप बिल्कुल ठीक कह रहे हैं, और एक वजह हम इसलिए कह रहे हैं कि टैरिफ वॉल को फिर से आपको वापस लाना है, ताकि आप इसमें प्रॉफिटेबिलिटी इंड्यूस करें फॉर डोमेस्टिक मैन्युफैक्चर। और अब आप देखिए कि साथ साथ अगर हम इंसेंटिव्स को वापस ले आते हैं, तो शायद ये जो इस वक्त जो बड़ा मसला खड़ा होगा जरूर कि इंटरेस्ट रेट्स बहुत ऊंचे जा रहे हैं और इन्वेस्टमेंट लेवल पे यकीनन उसका बुरा असर पड़ेगा, मगर कोशिश ये होनी चाहिए कि किसी ना किसी तरीके से हम कॉम्पनसेट करें, ताकि हमारे यहाँ जिस तरह मैं तो ये कह रहा हूँ कि जो कंज्यूमर गुड्स जो हम इंपोर्ट करते हैं वो ज्यादातर कम से कम इनिशियल स्टेजेस में पाकिस्तान बनाना चाहिए। ठीक है, द मोस्ट सोफिस्टिकेटेड टेक्नोलॉजी एंड ऑल दैट वी नीड टू इंपोर्ट। अब मैं एक आखिरी बात कह दूं, मे बी टू प्रोवोक यू, वक्त आ गया है कि हमें द बायलैटरल ट्रेड एग्रीमेंट विद चाइना उसको रिव्यू करना है। मेरी हम्बल राय ये है कि दिस हैज नॉट वर्कड to the interest of Pakistan yet, and it needs to be reviewed. 7 times import of Pakistan from China versus what we export to China, and the pricing and the transfer pricing issues and so on. इसके आगे मैं बात करना नहीं चाहता, ये सेंसिटिव सब्जेक्ट है, मगर सोच समझ के हमें आगे बढ़ना है। एंड में मैं शुक्रिया अदा करना चाहता हूँ सबसे पहले द आउटस्टैंडिंग क्वेश्चंस फ्रॉम द वाइस चांसलर, एंड उसके बाद में आप लोगों के बड़े वेल इन्फॉर्म्ड क्वेरीज। यू रियली पुट मी अंडर प्रेशर। और अच्छी खबर आपको सुना दूं, हमारे यहाँ बिजली वापस आ गई।
Thank you, Pasha Saab. Thank you very much. Very kind of you. We've had a great dialogue, and inshallah we'll continue with many other people. So please keep following us and keep asking tough questions so that we can all form a community. Sameer ने जो बात कही थी बिल्कुल ठीक है, पर I think Sameer साहब एक चीज है कि हमारी community बनी कोई नहीं है. We have never had discussions that will make a community that will put the government under pressure.
Yes.
That there is a thought community, and we
Yes.
must try and make that. That's a failing of our generation. I hope the younger people will be able to do it. Thank you, Ji. Thank you all. Pasha Saab,
Thank you.
Deeply indebted. See you soon, inshallah. All the best.
Inshallah.
Stay healthy. Stay enjoy. Bye-bye.